My counselor told me I tested positive for a condition that isn't medically recognized. Mrs. Holloway called me into her office third period on a Wednesday morning, and the first thing she said was, "Trevor, your screening results came back, and we need to discuss your diagnosis." I sat down in the chair across from her desk, confused because I didn't remember taking any screening. She had a manila folder open in front of her with my name printed on a label, and she was looking at me with this practiced expression of concern that guidance counselors must learn in training. "What diagnosis?" I asked. She slid a paper across the desk toward me. The header read, "Adolescent Behavioral Health Screening Results," and halfway down the page in bold letters it said, "Positive for Oppositional Defiance Spectrum Disorder." Below that were numbers and percentile rankings that meant nothing to me. "I don't understand," I said. "When did I take a screening?" Mrs. Holloway explained that all juniors had completed the assessment during health class 2 weeks ago. I vaguely remembered filling out some questionnaire about stress and emotions, but it had seemed routine, the kind of thing schools do constantly without explanation. "This condition affects approximately 15% of adolescents," she continued. "It's characterized by resistance to authority structures, difficulty accepting institutional guidance, and patterns of questioning established procedures." I stared at the paper, reading the description again. "That sounds made up." Mrs. Holloway's expression tightened slightly. "Trevor, this is a recognized condition that requires intervention. We've partnered with a treatment provider who specializes in adolescent behavioral modification. You'll be starting weekly sessions beginning next Monday." I pulled out my phone right there in her office and started searching for oppositional defiance spectrum disorder. The only results that came up were regular oppositional defiant disorder, which was a real childhood behavioral condition, but nothing about a spectrum version. No medical journals, no treatment guidelines, no diagnostic criteria from any psychiatric association. "Mrs. Holloway, I can't find any information about this condition online. Are you sure this is real?" She closed the folder with a sharp snap. "Trevor, this is exactly the kind of questioning behavior the screening identified. The condition was only recently classified, which is why you're not finding extensive literature yet. But the research is clear, and early intervention is critical." I asked who conducted the research and which organization classified it. She said the details were in the treatment provider's materials, and I would receive everything at my first session. I asked if my parents knew about this diagnosis. She said notification letters went home yesterday. I asked if I could opt out of the treatment. She said participation was mandatory for students who tested positive because untreated cases led to academic failure and disciplinary problems. I left her office feeling confused and angry in equal measure. The whole conversation had this surreal quality, where she was speaking with complete authority about something that apparently didn't exist in any medical database I could access. I spent my lunch period in the library on one of the computers, searching every variation of the condition name I could think of. I checked the DSM-5 diagnostic manual, searched psychiatric journals, looked through behavioral health organization websites. Nothing. The closest thing was regular oppositional defiant disorder, but that was diagnosed in young children, not high school juniors, and the criteria were completely different from what the screening paper described. I took screenshots of my search results showing 0 legitimate medical sources, saving them in a folder on my phone. When I got home that afternoon, I found the letter Mrs. Holloway mentioned sitting on the kitchen counter. My mom was reading it with a concerned expression. "Trevor, this says you tested positive for a behavioral disorder. Why didn't you tell me you were having problems?" I tried to explain that I wasn't having problems, that the whole thing seemed fake, that I couldn't find any medical information about this condition. My mom said schools don't diagnose fake conditions, and maybe I should take this seriously instead of immediately assuming everyone was wrong. That evening at dinner, I showed my parents the screenshots from my research. My dad looked through them and admitted it was strange that nothing came up, but he said maybe the condition was so new that online databases hadn't updated yet. My mom said the letter mentioned the treatment was covered by our insurance, which suggested it was a legitimate medical program. I pointed out that insurance coverage didn't necessarily mean something was medically valid, but they were already moving past my concerns toward practical questions about scheduling and transportation to the appointments. The letter said sessions would be held at a facility called Riverside Behavioral Health Center every Monday after school for 12 weeks. It included a consent form that needed both parent signatures. I asked if they could at least call our family doctor to ask about the condition before signing. My mom said she would mention it at my next checkup, but that we shouldn't delay treatment while waiting for appointments. She signed the form. My dad hesitated, looking at me, then signed as well. I felt this sinking realization that I was going to be forced into treatment for a condition that might not exist, and nobody believed my concerns were worth investigating first. The consent form went into my backpack for me to return the next day. Thursday morning, I got to school early and went straight to the nurse's office. I figured if anyone would know about medical conditions, it would be her. Nurse Deborah had been at the school for 15 years, and she'd always been straightforward with students. I showed her the screening results and asked if she'd heard of oppositional defiant spectrum disorder. She read the paper carefully, her expression growing confused. "Trevor, I've never encountered this diagnosis in any of my training or practice. Where did this come from?" I explained about the screening and Mrs. Holloway's insistence that it was a real condition requiring mandatory treatment. Nurse Deborah pulled up something on her computer, typing quickly and clicking through multiple screens. I'm checking our medical reference databases. There's no listing for this. The closest match is ODD, but that presents very differently and typically in younger children. She printed out information about actual oppositional defiant disorder and showed me the diagnostic criteria. They focused on angry moods, argumentative behavior toward parents, and deliberate rule-breaking. Nothing matched my behavior or the description on the screening results. This doesn't make sense, Nurse Deborah said. Who authorized this screening? I told her it happened in health class, and apparently all juniors took it. She said she should have been notified about any health screening in advance. This was the first she was hearing about it. Nurse Deborah asked if she could keep a copy of my results to research further. I took a photo of the paper with my phone and let her keep the original. She said she would reach out to the district health coordinator to ask about the screening's authorization and medical validity. As I was leaving, she stopped me and said quietly, "Trevor, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't let anyone tell you that questioning things is a disorder." I went to first period feeling slightly less alone, knowing at least one adult believed my concerns were legitimate. During class, I got a text from my friend Lucas asking if I could talk at lunch. We'd been friends since freshman year, and while we weren't super close, we hung out regularly in the same group. At lunch, I found Lucas sitting alone at a table in the corner of the cafeteria. He looked stressed, his knee bouncing up and down nervously. "Did you get called to the counselor's office yesterday?" he asked as soon as I sat down. I said yes, and asked if he got the same diagnosis. He nodded and pulled out his own screening results. Same condition, same mandatory treatment, same facility. "Trevor, I can't find anything about this online. I've been searching since yesterday. It's not in any medical database. My parents think I'm overreacting, but this doesn't feel right." We compared our screening papers and noticed they were nearly identical, except for our names and slightly different percentile scores. Both showed we tested positive for the same condition with similar severity ratings. Lucas asked what I was going to do about the mandatory treatment. I said my parents already signed the consent form, so I was probably stuck going unless I could prove the whole thing was fraudulent. He said his parents signed too, pressured by the letter's language about how untreated cases led to serious academic and social problems. Neither of us knew how to fight something our parents had already authorized. I suggested we should find out if other students got the same diagnosis and see if there was a pattern. Lucas agreed and said he would ask around carefully without causing drama. We split up to check with different friend groups, trying to gauge who else had been called to the counselor's office this week. By the end of lunch, we'd identified at least 5 other juniors who mentioned meeting with Mrs. Holloway about screening results. That afternoon, I created a group chat and added Lucas and 3 other students who confirmed they received the same diagnosis. I kept the initial message vague, just saying I wanted to compare notes about the health screening. Within an hour, all 3 confirmed they tested positive for oppositional defiant spectrum disorder and were starting treatment Monday. Friday morning, I met with the group before school in an empty classroom. There were 6 of us total, all juniors, all diagnosed with the same condition, all scheduled for the same treatment program. We went around sharing what we knew. Kayla mentioned she tried to find the treatment facility's website, but couldn't locate any information about Riverside Behavioral Health Center online. David said his older brother took health class last year and never heard about any behavioral screening. Priya asked if anyone's parents questioned the diagnosis, and we all said no, that our parents trusted the school's authority. I suggested we should all request copies of our complete screening results, including the questions we answered and how they were scored. If we could see the methodology, maybe we could challenge it. Everyone agreed to ask Mrs. Holloway for the full assessment. During second period, I got called to the principal's office. My stomach dropped, assuming this was related to yesterday's questions about the screening. Principal Foster was sitting behind his desk with Mrs. Holloway standing beside him. "Trevor, it's come to my attention that you've been discussing your diagnosis with other students and encouraging them to question their treatment. This is exactly the kind of behavior your screening identified as problematic." I explained I was just trying to understand a medical condition I'd never heard of, and that seemed to have no documentation in legitimate medical databases. Principal Foster said the screening was developed by qualified professionals and approved by the district's wellness committee. I asked who specifically developed it and which professionals were involved. He said those details were proprietary information protected by the provider's contract. Mrs. Holloway added that my resistance to accepting the diagnosis was concerning and suggested I might need more intensive intervention than the standard 12-week program. I felt my anger rising, but forced myself to stay calm. With all due respect, I have a right to question a medical diagnosis, especially one that doesn't appear in any recognized medical literature. My parents signed a consent form based on incomplete information. I'm asking for transparency about what condition I supposedly have and what treatment I'm being required to undergo. Principal Foster stood up, signaling the meeting was over. "Trevor, you'll attend your first session Monday as scheduled. Continued resistance will be documented as part of your behavioral pattern and could result in disciplinary consequences. You're dismissed." I walked out of his office shaking with frustration. The implied threat was clear. Accept the diagnosis and treatment or face punishment for refusing. That afternoon, I went home and spent 3 hours documenting everything that had happened. I created a timeline starting with the screening and health class, listed every conversation with Mrs. Holloway and the nurse, recorded the group's findings about multiple students receiving identical diagnoses, and compiled all my failed searches for medical information about the condition. I saved everything in a cloud folder with timestamps and screenshots. My mom came home from work and found me at the kitchen table surrounded by printed papers. "Trevor," the school called. "They said you're organizing other students to refuse treatment. This is serious. Why are you making this so difficult?" I showed her everything I'd compiled: the lack of medical recognition, the identical diagnoses across multiple students, the facility that had no online presence, the threats of disciplinary action for questioning. She looked through the papers, and I could see her certainty wavering slightly. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. I said I wanted her to call our family doctor and ask about this condition before I started treatment. I wanted her to request the full screening methodology from the school. I wanted her to question why a school was diagnosing behavioral disorders without involving medical professionals. She agreed to call Dr. Finch on Monday morning. The weekend passed in anxious waiting. I kept researching, expanding my searches to include the treatment facility, the screening company, and any connection between them. Late Saturday night, I found something. A news article from another state describing a lawsuit against a school district for implementing an unauthorized behavioral screening program funded by a pharmaceutical company. The program had diagnosed hundreds of students with conditions that required medication manufactured by that same pharmaceutical company. The lawsuit alleged the district received kickbacks for each student enrolled in treatment. The article was 3 years old, and the case had been settled out of court with no admission of wrongdoing, but the pattern was eerily similar to what was happening at our school. I saved the article and sent it to Lucas and the others in the group chat. Within minutes, everyone was responding with alarm. David found another article about a similar program in a different state. Kayla discovered that several pharmaceutical companies had been fined for illegal marketing of drugs to adolescents through school-based programs. We were all seeing the same pattern emerging. This wasn't about helping students with behavioral problems. This was about profit, about diagnosing healthy kids with fake conditions so someone could bill insurance for unnecessary treatment and maybe push medication. Monday morning, my mom called Dr. Finch's office before I left for school. She explained the situation and asked if he could look into the condition. The receptionist said Dr. Finch was with patients all morning but would call back during lunch. I went to school carrying the consent form, still not sure if I was going to turn it in. First period, an announcement came over the PA system. All students diagnosed through the recent behavioral health screening should report to the library immediately for a mandatory informational session. I grabbed my bag and headed to the library, where I found about 20 other students gathering. Mrs. Holloway stood at the front with 2 people I didn't recognize, a man and woman both wearing professional attire with visitor badges. Mrs. Holloway introduced them as representatives from Riverside Behavioral Health Center, who would be explaining the treatment program. The woman, who introduced herself as Dr. Lydia Vance, began a presentation about oppositional defiance spectrum disorder. She described it as a newly recognized condition that affected adolescents' ability to function within structured environments. She said early intervention was critical to prevent long-term problems with employment and relationships. She never once cited any medical research or referenced any psychiatric organization's recognition of the condition. I raised my hand. "Dr. Vance, which medical organization recognized this condition? I can't find it in the DSM-5 or any psychiatric association's diagnostic guidelines." Dr. Vance smiled in a way that felt condescending. "The condition is recognized within specialized behavioral health communities. The formal classification process with the American Psychiatric Association takes years, but clinicians are already treating it based on emerging research." I asked what research specifically. She said the research was published in peer-reviewed journals, but didn't name any specific publications or authors. Lucas raised his hand next. "What treatment will we be receiving? The consent form doesn't specify what the sessions involve." Dr. Vance explained the treatment combined cognitive behavioral therapy with medication management. Several students immediately started asking what medication, and she said that would be determined individually based on symptom severity. The man next to her, who hadn't introduced himself, added that all medications were FDA approved and covered by insurance. I felt sick. They were planning to put us on psychiatric medication for a condition that didn't exist. After the presentation, we were told to turn in our consent forms at the front desk. I held mine, unsigned, and walked past without submitting it. Lucas did the same. Several other students hesitated but ultimately turned theirs in, pressured by the authority figures watching. During lunch, my mom called. Dr. Finch had gotten back to her. He'd never heard of oppositional defiance spectrum disorder and couldn't find any reference to it in his medical databases or any communications from psychiatric organizations. He said it sounded concerning and recommended not starting any treatment until the diagnosis could be verified by an independent psychiatrist. My mom said she was calling the school to withdraw consent. Relief flooded through me. I had parental support to refuse this. But then, Mrs. Holloway called me to her office during 6th period. She said my mother had called to withdraw consent, but because I was already flagged as high risk based on my screening results, and my pattern of organizing resistance, the school was overriding parental withdrawal. State law allowed schools to mandate mental health interventions for students deemed at risk of harming themselves or others. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I'm not at risk of harming anyone. I questioned a diagnosis. That's not a safety threat. Mrs. Holloway pulled out a new form. Trevor, you've been documented expressing anger toward authority figures, organizing other students to resist treatment, and showing escalating defiance. These are all indicators of risk. You'll be attending your first session this afternoon. A staff member will escort you. I stood up, my hands shaking. You can't force me into treatment for a condition that doesn't exist. My parents withdrew consent. My doctor says this isn't a real diagnosis. You're overstepping your authority. Mrs. Holloway's expression hardened. Trevor, sit down. If you refuse to comply, school security will escort you to the facility. You can go cooperatively, or you can go with security involvement. Your choice. I felt trapped, cornered, with no good options. If I refused, they'd physically force me, which would give them more ammunition to claim I was dangerous. If I went cooperatively, I'd be submitting to treatment I didn't need for a condition that didn't exist. I made a split-second decision. I need to call my mom. Mrs. Holloway said I could call from her office phone. My mom answered immediately, and I explained what was happening. She was furious, saying the school had no right to override her parental authority. Mrs. Holloway took the phone and repeated the legal justification about mandated interventions for at-risk students. My mom said she was leaving work immediately and would be at the school within 20 minutes. Mrs. Holloway said the transport to the facility was scheduled for 3:15, which was in 10 minutes. If my mom wanted to discuss this, she could do so at the treatment center. The school security guard, Officer Dennis, appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Holloway told him to escort me to the front circle where the transport van was waiting. I walked with Officer Dennis through the hallways, passing other students who stared at me being escorted by security. The humiliation burned. I wasn't a criminal. I wasn't dangerous. I was a student who asked questions. Outside, a white van with Riverside Behavioral Health Center printed on the side was idling in the pickup lane. 3 other students were already inside, all looking scared and confused. I climbed in, and Officer Dennis closed the door behind me. The driver, an older man who didn't introduce himself, pulled out of the school parking lot. None of us spoke during the 20-minute drive. The facility was in a medical complex on the edge of town, a single-story building with bars on the windows. That detail alone made my stomach turn. We were led inside through a locked door that required a key card. The reception area looked clinical and sterile, with hard plastic chairs and fluorescent lighting. A woman at the desk checked our names against a list and directed us to a waiting room down the hall. The other students and I sat in uncomfortable silence until my name was called. A man in a white coat introduced himself as Dr. Raymond Cross and led me to an office. He had me sit in a chair while he reviewed papers in a folder. Trevor, I'm going to be managing your treatment plan. First, we need to establish your baseline symptoms and determine appropriate intervention strategies. He asked me a series of questions about my mood, my relationships with teachers, how I handled frustration. Every question felt loaded, designed to make normal adolescent experiences sound pathological. I answered honestly but carefully, aware that anything I said could be twisted. Then he pulled out a prescription pad. Based on your screening results and initial assessment, I'm starting you on a medication regimen. You'll be taking risperidone to help with impulse control and oppositional behaviors. I knew that name. Risperidone was an antipsychotic medication used for serious conditions including schizophrenia and severe bipolar disorder. I don't have psychosis or bipolar disorder, I said. Why would I take an antipsychotic? Dr. Cross said it was also used off-label for behavioral issues in adolescence. I asked what the side effects were. He listed them quickly, minimizing the serious ones. Weight gain, fatigue, hormonal changes, movement disorders. I said I didn't want to take it. He said medication was a required component of the treatment program. The office door opened and my mom rushed in, breathless. What is going on here? I withdrew my consent for treatment. You can't medicate my son without my permission. Dr. Cross stood up calmly. Mrs. Hartley, your son was identified as high risk through our screening process. The school has authorization under state mental health intervention laws to mandate treatment when a student poses a risk to themselves or others. My mom's voice got louder. He's not a risk to anyone. He questioned a diagnosis. That's not dangerous behavior. I'm taking him home right now. Dr. Cross moved to block the door. If you remove Trevor from the facility without completing the intake process, the school will file a report with Child Protective Services for educational neglect and refusing necessary mental health treatment. Do you really want CPS investigating your parenting? The threat hung in the air. My mom looked at me, then back at Dr. Cross, calculating the consequences. I want to speak to a lawyer before anything else happens. Dr. Cross said that was her right, but I would need to remain at the facility during initial assessment, which typically took 2 hours. My mom pulled out her phone and stepped into the hallway to make calls. I sat in that office, trapped, while adults argued about whether I could be forced to take antipsychotic medication for a condition that didn't exist. An hour later, my mom returned with information from a lawyer. He'd told her the school's legal justification was questionable, but fighting it would require filing emergency court documents, which would take days. In the meantime, I could be held at the facility under the mental health hold provisions. The lawyer recommended we complete the intake without agreeing to medication, document everything, and file a formal complaint with the state education department and medical board. My mom explained this to me in front of Dr. Cross, making clear we were complying under protest and would be pursuing legal action. Dr. Cross said he understood and would note our concerns in my file. The intake continued with more questionnaires, a physical exam, and a psychiatric evaluation. Every interaction felt performative, like they were going through motions to justify the predetermined treatment plan. When Dr. Cross again presented the prescription for risperidone, my mom refused to pick it up from the pharmacy. He said the medication could also be administered at the facility during sessions. My mom said absolutely not without a court order. The standoff ended with Dr. Cross agreeing to defer the medication decision to next week's session. We left the facility at 6 p.m., 4 hours after I'd been taken from school. In the car, my mom was shaking with anger. "This is insane. They can't do this. We're fighting this, Trevor, whatever it takes." That evening, she contacted 3 different lawyers, looking for someone who specialized in education law and medical ethics. The first 2 said they didn't handle these types of cases. The third, a woman named Diane Montgomery, agreed to meet with us Wednesday evening. My mom also filed formal complaints with the State Board of Education, the Medical Licensing Board, and the State Health Department. She sent detailed letters describing the screening program, the questionable diagnosis, the threatened forced medication, and the override of parental consent. Tuesday at school, word had spread that I'd been physically escorted to the treatment facility. Some students were sympathetic. Others thought I'd caused my own problems by questioning everything. Lucas pulled me aside between classes and said 2 more students from our group had been forced to attend sessions yesterday, and both were started on medication. Their parents had signed under pressure after receiving the same CPS threats. I asked what medications. He said one was on risperidone, the other on Risperdal, which was just a brand name for the same drug. Both were already experiencing side effects, extreme fatigue, and difficulty concentrating. During lunch, Kayla approached me looking terrified. "Trevor, my session is this afternoon. My parents signed the consent because they're scared of CPS. What do I do?" I told her what the lawyer said. "Document everything. Record the session if possible. Don't agree to any medication without understanding what it is and what the side effects are. Ask for a second opinion from an independent psychiatrist." She said her parents couldn't afford a private psychiatrist. I said there were patient advocacy organizations that might help, and I'd ask our lawyer for resources. The afternoon felt endless. I couldn't focus in class, thinking about Kayla and the others being pushed into treatment they didn't need. After school, I met with Lucas and David to compare notes. David had started researching Riverside Behavioral Health Center's corporate structure. He'd found corporate registration documents showing it was wholly owned by a company called Behavioral Solutions Group, which was in turn owned by a pharmaceutical company called Prescott Pharmaceuticals. The connection was buried under layers of subsidiary relationships, but it was there. A drug manufacturer owned the treatment facility that was diagnosing students and prescribing its own medications. The conflict of interest was staggering. We started digging into Prescott Pharmaceuticals and found a history of legal settlements for illegal marketing practices, Medicare fraud, and off-label drug promotion to children. Wednesday evening, my mom and I met with Diane Montgomery in her office downtown. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, with a wall of law degrees and certifications behind her desk. We walked her through everything, starting with the initial screening and ending with yesterday's forced intake and medication pressure. She took detailed notes, asked clarifying questions, and reviewed all our documentation. When we finished, she leaned back in her chair. "This is one of the most egregious cases I've seen of institutional overreach. The screening program appears to be unlawful, the diagnosis is medically unrecognized, and forcing treatment over parental objection violates multiple statutes. But here's the problem. Schools have broad authority under mental health intervention laws, and proving they're abusing that authority requires demonstrating the screening is fraudulent and the diagnosis is intentionally false. That's going to take time and significant legal resources." My mom asked what our options were. Diane said we could file for an emergency injunction to stop the forced treatment, which might take a week to get a hearing. We could file a lawsuit against the school district, the treatment facility, and potentially the pharmaceutical company, which would take months or years. We could file criminal complaints, though prosecutors rarely pursued cases against schools. Or we could try to build enough public pressure that the district shut down the program voluntarily. Diane recommended a multi-pronged approach. File the emergency injunction to protect me specifically. Submit public records requests for all documents related to the screening program, including contracts with Riverside Behavioral Health Center and any financial arrangements. Contact local media to investigate the story. Organize other affected families to file complaints and potentially join a class action lawsuit. She said her fees would be substantial but offered to work on contingency if we pursued the full lawsuit. My mom agreed immediately. We left her office with a plan and a timeline. The injunction would be filed Thursday morning. The public records request would go out Friday, and Diane would start reaching out to reporters who covered education and healthcare issues. Thursday morning, I went to school knowing the legal battle had begun. During second period, Mrs. Holloway called me to her office again. Trevor, I've been informed you're pursuing legal action against the school. I want you to understand that this will not end well for you. The district has extensive legal resources and a responsibility to ensure student safety. Your resistance is making your condition worse. I said nothing, just sat there while she tried to intimidate me. She said my next treatment session was scheduled for Monday, and failure to attend would result in suspension. I asked if she'd received any legal documents yet. Her expression tightened. Not yet, but we're prepared for whatever actions you take. The injunction hearing was scheduled for Friday afternoon. Diane called Thursday evening to prepare us. She explained we needed to prove immediate harm from the forced treatment and show that the school's actions violated my rights. She'd be arguing that the diagnosis was medically fraudulent and that forcing antipsychotic medication for a non-existent condition constituted assault. The judge would decide whether to grant a temporary injunction stopping the treatment, while the larger legal questions were resolved. Friday morning, I woke up feeling sick with nerves. My mom had taken the day off work to attend the hearing with me. We met Diane at the courthouse at 1 p.m. The school district's lawyer was already there, a man in an expensive suit who looked completely unbothered by the proceedings. The hearing started at 1:30 in a small courtroom with just the judge, the lawyers, my mom and me, and 2 representatives from the school district. Diane presented our case, walking the judge through the timeline, the lack of medical recognition for the condition, the pharmaceutical company connections, the override of parental consent, and the attempted forced medication. She submitted affidavits from Dr. Finch, stating the diagnosis had no medical validity, and from Nurse Deborah describing how the screening program bypassed normal medical oversight. The district's lawyer argued that schools had broad authority to implement mental health programs and that parents had consented through signing the forms. Diane countered that consent obtained through coercion and false medical claims wasn't valid consent. She pointed out that my mother had withdrawn consent and the school had overridden it using threats of CPS involvement. The district's lawyer said the withdrawal came after the screening identified me as high risk. Diane asked what specific risk I posed. The lawyer said my pattern of defiance and resistance to authority. Diane asked if questioning a medical diagnosis constituted a safety threat. The lawyer said it demonstrated the very behaviors the treatment was designed to address. The judge interrupted. Counselor, are you arguing that a student's skepticism about a diagnosis justifies forced psychiatric treatment? The lawyer backpedaled. We're arguing that the school's mental health professionals determined intervention was necessary based on comprehensive assessment. The judge asked if those mental health professionals were employed by the treatment facility with a financial interest in diagnosing students. The lawyer hesitated. The facility provides services under contract with the district. The judge flipped through the documents Diane had submitted showing Prescott Pharmaceuticals' ownership of the facility. This court has serious concerns about the conflicts of interest and the lack of independent medical verification. I'm granting a temporary injunction prohibiting Riverside Behavioral Health Center from providing treatment to Trevor Hartley, pending further review. The school district is ordered to immediately cease requiring his participation in the program. Relief hit me so hard, I almost started crying right there in the courtroom. My mom grabbed my hand and squeezed it. The judge continued. Furthermore, I'm ordering the school district to provide this court with complete documentation of the screening program's authorization, medical basis, and any financial arrangements with treatment providers. I want to see the screening instrument itself, the validation studies showing its diagnostic accuracy, and evidence that it meets medical standards for behavioral health assessment. You have 1 week to compile this information. The district's lawyer looked uncomfortable, but agreed. We left the courthouse with a court order protecting me, but I knew this was just the beginning. The judge's questions suggested he was skeptical of the entire program, but he'd stopped short of shutting it down completely. That would require proving the whole thing was fraudulent, not just protecting one student. Over the weekend, Lucas called me with devastating news. One of the students in the treatment program, a girl named Sophia, who'd been started on risperidone, had been hospitalized after suffering a severe movement disorder called tardive dyskinesia. Her face had started twitching uncontrollably, and the movement spread to her arms and legs. Her parents rushed her to the emergency room, where doctors confirmed it was a known side effect of antipsychotic medications. The condition could be permanent. Sophia's parents were threatening to sue the school and the treatment facility. Her mom had posted about it in a parent Facebook group, and the post was being shared hundreds of times. People were finally starting to ask questions about the program. Monday morning, the school was in chaos. Half the parents whose kids were in the treatment program were calling to withdraw consent. The other half were demanding to know why they hadn't been told about serious side effects. Principal Foster sent an email to all families saying the screening program was under review and treatment sessions were being temporarily postponed pending consultation with medical experts. Mrs. Holloway was absent from school, allegedly on medical leave. The reversal happened fast. Within days, the district announced they were suspending the behavioral health screening program and conducting an independent audit of how it was implemented. Riverside Behavioral Health Center's contract was terminated immediately. Students who'd been started on medications were told to consult with their personal physicians about tapering off. Diane filed public records requests and received thousands of pages of documents. The evidence was damning. The screening program had been implemented without school board approval. The contract with Riverside gave the facility 40% of all insurance reimbursements, creating a direct financial incentive to diagnose as many students as possible. The screening questions were designed to flag normal adolescent behaviors as pathological. Anyone who scored high on questions about questioning authority, preferring independent work, or expressing frustration with rules was automatically classified as positive for the spectrum disorder. The treatment protocol required psychiatric medication as a first-line intervention, specifically medications manufactured by Prescott Pharmaceuticals. The facility received additional bonuses for each prescription written. Internal emails showed administrators knew the diagnosis wasn't medically recognized, but believed the legal risk was acceptable because schools had broad mental health intervention authority. One email from the superintendent explicitly said, "Even if a few parents complain, most will comply rather than fight the system." Diane released these documents to multiple news organizations. The story exploded across local and then state media. "School district partnered with pharmaceutical company to diagnose healthy students," was the headline in the state's largest newspaper. Investigative reporters found similar programs had been attempted in 4 other states, all funded by Prescott Pharmaceuticals, all eventually shut down after lawsuits. The state medical board opened an investigation into Dr. Cross and the other practitioners at Riverside for prescribing powerful psychiatric medications without proper diagnostic justification. The State Board of Education launched their own investigation into the district's authorization of the program. 3 weeks after my court hearing, the superintendent resigned under pressure. The school board voted unanimously to terminate Principal Foster. Mrs. Holloway retired abruptly with a settlement agreement that included a non-disclosure clause. Riverside Behavioral Health Center closed permanently, and Prescott Pharmaceuticals faced federal investigation for illegal marketing to minors. Sophia's family filed a lawsuit that eventually settled for an undisclosed amount, with a portion funding her ongoing medical treatment for the movement disorder. Diane filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of all students who'd been diagnosed and started on medication, claiming fraud, medical battery, and emotional distress. The case was still pending when I graduated, but the district had already begun settlement negotiations. My mom and I were invited to testify before a state legislative committee examining gaps in education law that allowed the program to happen. New legislation was proposed requiring independent medical verification for any school-based mental health diagnosis and prohibiting districts from contracting with treatment facilities owned by pharmaceutical companies. The bill passed unanimously 8 months later, named the Student Medical Protection Act. Lucas and I remained friends through everything, bonded by the experience of questioning authority when everyone told us to comply. David went on to study investigative journalism in college, citing our research into the corporate structure as what inspired his career path. Kayla struggled with trust issues with authority figures for years, but eventually became a patient advocate helping families navigate medical and educational systems. For me, the most lasting impact was understanding that institutions can be wrong, even when they speak with complete confidence and authority. That questioning something that doesn't make sense isn't defiance or disorder, it's critical thinking. That protecting yourself and others sometimes requires standing alone against systems designed to make you comply. I learned that documentation and evidence matter more than emotional arguments, that legal processes move slowly but can deliver justice, and that there are adults who will stand with teenagers when they're right, even when it's professionally risky. I learned that pharmaceutical companies will exploit vulnerable populations for profit if given the opportunity, that schools can fail to protect students when financial incentives cloud judgment, and that one person asking questions can sometimes unravel an entire system built on fraudulent foundations. The screening papers went into a folder I kept through college, a reminder of how close I came to being medicated for a condition that never existed. 23 students had been diagnosed before the program collapsed. 18 had been started on antipsychotic medications. 3 suffered lasting side effects, including movement disorders and metabolic problems. The settlement fund eventually paid for their ongoing medical care, but no amount of money could undo the harm. The story followed me, appearing in news articles whenever journalists covered pharmaceutical company misconduct or school district oversight failures. I was interviewed for a documentary about corporate influence in education. The story ended up mattering beyond just our school or our lawsuit, becoming part of a larger conversation about consent, transparency, and protecting children from institutional abuse disguised as help. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.